There can be fewer instances in life more incredible than the event of finding yourself bang in the center of a time slip. Time slips are a subject we have journeyed into twice previous. However, it would appear this remarkable phenomenon is far more common than we initially suspected. We begin with an account from Ange from Great Britain. Back in the early 70s, my then boyfriend and I were hitchhiking. Really not safe to do that now. We were dropped off in a remote hamlet. Not a kind thing to do to us. We went into a small inn and each had a drink. We didn't stay long. The few older locals kept staring at us, and they seemed to be wearing slightly dated clothes. My boyfriend brought our drinks and told me to hurry as we were in danger and had to leave. I was reluctant as it was cold outside, and as he gulped his brandy in one go, I was a little slower. He was unusually panicked and firm as he told me to drink or leave it as he was going, and began to walk out. I followed and asked what had been said to him. He told me nothing, but he was certain that they were going to kill us if we didn't leave fast. He wasn't the over-imaginative type, and that was the only reason I didn't argue. It was out of character for him. Still, I didn't take what he said seriously, though. We walked alongside the single, narrow country land, following the same direction as the driver who had dropped us off there. No traffic for around 15 minutes, when, at last, a car came towards us. We agreed we would try and hitch a ride in it, albeit back the way we had come. At least we knew there was a dual carriageway a few miles back. Thankfully, the driver stopped. Maybe 3 to 4 minutes later, we began to pass the inn, which was closed. At only around 9:40 p.m, I remarked how early it had closed for the night. The driver replied it had closed down 5 years before. We told him we were in there maybe 20 minutes earlier, and he was a bit taken aback. He then told us he had heard of strange things happening in the area, but had never known anything himself, so wouldn't believe it. My boyfriend and I politely remained quiet, and the driver let us out on the slip road to the dual carriageway. There was another eerie thing that happened, to do with a large, unoccupied, slightly neglected-looking house as we had gone into the hamlet. Coming back out in the car, every room was lit up and there was a car outside. We also mentioned that to the driver, who lightly replied that a family lived there and they always had all the lights on every evening. It no longer appeared neglected either. My boyfriend and I discussed it briefly and agreed a time slip was the only explanation. We both suspected that the youngish man who had dropped us off by the then abandoned-looking house had something to do with it somehow, that for no particular reason he wished us harm. There had been something uncanny and unsettling about him. We had both thought so earlier, and even more so after we returned to the right time. If it was to do with him, there was no indication as to how. He only had an old, normal manual car. He was dressed typically for the early 70s, not dated as those in the pub. We agreed that we each would put it down to imagination, as if either of us had been alone as it was just so far out. We also agreed we didn't want to discuss it again, as it had been too creepy. He and I went separate ways a few months later, and it took me years to ever mention it to anyone else. I've told maybe 3-4 people since I was first able to speak of it again, but of course have always been met with complete skepticism. Ange isn't alone. So many individuals who have shared their accounts explained the same nervousness of telling others for fear of misunderstandings and disbelief. However, as with our previous case, Angie's story echoes striking similarities that are difficult to disprove. Our second report comes courtesy of Malcolm, a window fitter from Bristol, United Kingdom. We're going back to the mid-1980s here, but to me it could easily have been last week. It's that fresh in my memory. I was in my early 20s and had just passed my driving test and thought I was the dog's Watsits. A mate and I had been driving about late this particular night, as young lads do, you know, the age-old chestnut of more confidence than skill on the road. But we didn't give two hoots. We felt indestructible back then. We'd been out for a couple of hours when I was suddenly very aware I was dangerously low on fuel, running on vapour. It wasn't clever at all. We drove around until, mercifully, we found a tiny petrol station out in the sticks. So, without delay, I zoomed in to fill up. It's funny. The second we pulled in, I felt a very strange vibe about the place, almost as though we shouldn't be there somehow. Not wanting to dwell on my uneasy feeling, I cracked on with filling the car up. My mate waited in the car and I went in to pay. As I walked in the door, I was taken by surprise at the appearance of the old place. It was really run down, dowdy. All these old brands stacked up clumsily on the shelves. Most of them I didn't recognise. There was an elderly bloke behind the counter in an old off-white apron who eyed me with deep suspicion as I approached him. I remember he flinched a bit as I came near. That odd sensation came over me again. I just knew something was off. "Bit late to be about, isn't it, Sonny?" he said. Reminded me of my dad a bit. I explained I just wanted to pay for my fuel, and you'd have thought I'd asked him for his hand in marriage. He screwed his face up and looked at me like he'd stepped in something unpleasant. He began lecturing me about how men were out there now putting their lives on the line for hoodlums like me to take advantage. Well, I went from stunned to, frankly, irate. How dare this old fellow start preaching to me, a paying customer? My rebellious youthfulness took over at that point, and I shoved the cash over to him on the counter, threw him a look of contempt and briskly left. I knew I'd have erupted at him otherwise. As I walked to my car, I don't mind telling you, I was stirring myself up with rage. It bubbled. How dare he? I opened the car door and started slagging the old buzzard off to my mate who thought I was yanking his chain. "Right," I said with alarming assertiveness. "Get your arse out of this motor and I'll show you myself." So, off we went, storming back in, feeling like something out of a mafia movie. In reality, we must have looked a bit naff, you know? Just as before, I opened the door and, blow me, the entire shop was completely different. It was all familiar, modern. Where the old geezer was stood, there was a young man of about 26 manning the till, looking at us as though we were about to rob the place. "Where's the old bloke?" I demanded. "What old bloke?" said the cashier. "It's only me here on a Friday night." I couldn't accept it. I felt as though I was the unsuspecting mark in an elaborate hoax. Beetles about, or whatever. "My God," I said, feeling the blood drain from my body. My mate must have thought I was on something. I remember the whole thing so well. It freaks me out even now, and it's worse because only a couple of people have ever believed me. So I've pretty much stopped talking about it now. Two staggering accounts from witnesses adamant of their time-slip encounters, each as fascinating as the last. It would appear time slips really are just another part of our world. A world we're only just on the cusp of beginning to examine. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share, but all the while, don't have nightmares.